If you have no clarity in your life, I have a 3-step framework that you can share and reference whenever you feel like you don't have a direction or you're not sure what's next in your life. For me, as someone in the past who had no idea what was next and had no clarity on their next step, life was very confusing. But now that I have this framework, I can rely on this 3-step process that I'm going to share with you today. So the first step in the process is going to be to stabilize and visualize. Ask yourself, what is the current problem that you are unsure of? To be able to work through a problem, the first step is to identify it and define it. So you're going to ask yourself in your professional life, in your relationships, in your health, or in your resources, what's unclear? What are you unsure of? Because sometimes in my life, when I'm unsure of something and I go back and I define it and identify it, I find that I'm just stressed about it. I'm just anxious. I know my next step. I just need to let the factor of time play its role. So you have to ask yourself, is it just time that you need to work through this thing? Or is it actually something that you are unsure of? By defining this problem, you're going to be better equipped in these later steps. So ask yourself, what's the current problem and what are you unclear of? And a good place to start is professional, relationships, resources, or health. Those are the first 4 categories that you can reference. Now, after you've defined the problem and identified, okay, in my professional life, I'm really unsure of what's next in the next 5 years. I'm not happy at my job. I want to make a transition. Because from there, you then have a scope. And with your scope, you then ask yourself, what are your values? I was just working with a client of mine she was at a company who did not value the customer. They valued the money. And she was a customer service team lead. And her values was really valuing the customer and providing great service. This company did not do that. So that created a mismatch on clarity. She was unsure of her direction and she had to leave that job because it was not in line with your values. So you identify what's the current problem and what am I unclear on about that problem? Then you go, what are your values? And you can just go through your values. Maybe it's honesty, maybe it's creativity, maybe it's freedom, maybe it's helping others. Whatever it is, you define your values because that's going to become your true north. Now, once you've identified the problem and you've then had your true north, you can then go through these situations. These 4 situations are as follows. If I were to give you $100 million, what would you do with it? What would you buy? Where would you go? If I told you that I would pay you $100,000 for the rest of your life, you just had to be doing something you'd enjoy, what would you do? If you had a 3-year expiration date, what would you do with your time left? And finally, if you were at your 100th birthday, what are some of the legacy items? What do you want people talking about? Those 4 situations can help you really identify what's next. And those 4 work best within the professional area. If you're unsure of what's next in the next 5 to 10 years within your professional area, running through those 4 situations can be helpful. Maybe your problem isn't in the professional area. Maybe it's relationships. You're really unsure of your relationships in the next 5 years. You want to undergo some transformation on a personal level, and usually that comes with transformation within your relationships. And so for those instances, you can ask yourself the question, what does amazing look like? You can ask yourself, in the next 12 months, in the next 5 years, what does amazing look like in my relationships? Because then you'll find, okay, you know what? These are the activities I'd be doing. These are the conversations I'd be having, because then you could start to seek those things. And you have another true north to go off of when finding new relationships. And then you have a path from where you are to where you want to go within your relationships. So that's another question you can ask yourself. Now, on top of asking yourself, what does amazing look like? Another question you can ask yourself is, what is making the most out of your life? And this question is best for maybe with your health or with your resources. If you're unsure of those 2 things, you can ask yourself, what is making the most out of my life? And by defining that, again, you get the state you're in and the state you want to go to, and then everything in between will come in these next 2 steps. So within the first step of stabilization and visualization, it's really clear that you identify and define the problem, create a true north, and run through those questions for yourself because you're going to get a really good base. The idea is just simply to define the problem in the first step, because in the next step, it's time to move into strategy. How are you going to get there? Because in the first step, we defined where we are and where we want to go, but now we have all this stuff in between. Now it is in time to employ a strategy of how are we going to get there. There's probably about 10,000 ways to get there, but what is the best way for you to get there? What is the best way for you to solve your problem? And so the first question you can ask yourself is, what do you need to get there? So again, if you're unsure with your professional life in the next 5 years, you'd ask yourself, what resources do you need to make the changes? What education do you need to make the changes? And what kind of time is it going to take to make those changes? And so by asking those questions, you start to think like, okay, to make a job change, I might not need that much money or resources, but what I do need is I need more education in this space to be able to get to this role. Or I need time to put in those applications, so I need to carve out this amount of time per week to be able to do so. It just gets your mind running, and that's the point of strategy, to get your mind running of, okay, how are the ways that I could get to where I want to go? Let's say relationships. You may need more resources to be friends with the people you want to be friends with. For me, since I'm a business owner, I want to be friends with fellow business owners. So for me to get there, I may have to have business success to then be exposed to those people. Same thing with education. I need to be educated in the business space and spend time in that space to then find those relationships. So by asking yourself, what do you need? It'll get you thinking. And then also another great thing you can ask yourself in strategy is who do you need to get there? Who, mentors, friends, family, what support do you need? Who do you need to get to your goal? What do you need to get to your goal? That's kind of ties in with the resources. What things do you need to get there? When are you going to get to your goal? And those are goals that you'd set, daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly goals to get there, and when do you want to hit those? I encourage you to not put too much emphasis on the direction and on the where you want to go, but it's a good question to ask. Where do you want to go? I mean, we kind of defined that in the last step, but where do you want to go and how are you going to get there? And one of the most important things to ask yourself is why? Why do you want to get there? Why do you want to make this change? Why do you want to take this step towards that direction? Why are you driving towards this thing? If it's a mismatch of values, easy. That's why you want to make this change. If you want to make different relationships because it's going to change the impact of your life, that's another great reason. So ask yourself who, what, when, where, and why. And then also, how are you going to get there and what do you need to get there? That's strategy. Figure out your strategy and how you're going to get there. The third and the final step is to execute. And this, I can tell you, by far the most important step. Because if we go back to you're unsure of your career in the next 5 years, you could spend all the time in the world defining the problem, figuring out why you don't like your job, figuring out where you want to go, figuring out your strategy. But if you take no action, nothing will change in your life. And I mean absolutely nothing. You will just be thinking to yourself, and then you'll go back to that job that you hate, that you want to change, and you're going to still feel the lack of clarity, the lack of direction in your life, and still going to be uncomfortable. So execution and taking action is the most important step throughout this whole framework. So what you need to do is find your first step. So again, as earlier I said, we know where we're at. We know where we want to go. What's the first step? What's the first thing you need to do? So the first thing you need to do is actually going through and defining the problem. But once you've done that, okay, you've decided, you know what? This job is no longer for me. I have found that I want to go to this job for X, Y, or Z reasons. The first step, maybe talking to someone in that space. Maybe finding an application to apply for. Whatever it is, find your first action, the first actionable item that you can take that'll make a meaningful difference in your life, and then do that action. After you take action, then you can start to ask yourself, okay, what barriers are gonna hold me back? So, okay, you start to do some applications. Oh my gosh, I have a time barrier because I'm not setting enough time per week to be able to send the amount of applications I need, the volume of applications I need to make sure I can get to this role within 3 months or 6 months or whatever. So you have to ask yourself, what barriers will hold you back? With relationships, maybe it's this shiny object syndrome that a new relationship comes in your life and you're like, oh, this relationship's gonna be the one. And you just think that's gonna be the one. And so that's a barrier. So you have to identify what barriers are gonna come up. And it's really easy to see the barriers, especially after you've taken action. It can kind of be hard when you're in the strategy step of, okay, this is how I think I'm gonna attack it. But without taking action, you might not be able to understand what barriers. You might be able to see some of them, but you're not gonna see all of them until you're taking action. That's why I bring up the barriers and execution step. Start taking action, you'll see barriers coming up. For me, sending messages and cold DMs to be able to get coaching clients, If I would have thought about the barriers beforehand, it wouldn't have been very helpful. But once I got in it and I see, oh my gosh, deliverability is one of the biggest barriers. I have to make sure that I'm staying within the guidelines of the platform to make sure I end up in their inbox. That's a huge barrier that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of before starting it. So that's why I encourage action first, barrier second. And then also, once you identify the barriers, you can ask yourself, what systems can you put in place to help? What goals can you set? How can you hold yourself accountable? Maybe you decided, okay, you know what? I have no direction in my physical health and I'm kind of just letting myself degrade over time. I want to take a big step in making sure I'm being healthy and hitting the gym. Well, a piece of that would be setting out your clothes before, having a good program, having a gym signed up. Those are all systems to make it a lot easier for you to go to exercise instead of just doing nothing. So that's the 3-step framework. Again, stabilize, visualize, strategize, and execute. You can repeat these things with almost any problem in your life, but especially if you don't have clarity or you don't have direction. And professional relationships, resources, and health, those 4 categories I referenced, if you want to get a more in-depth analysis of that, take the balance wheel in the description below, and that can help you break that down in your own life. And I'll see you guys in the next video.